Picture this. You're standing in the opulent halls of ancient Persia in the year 522 BC, witnessing something that would make your blood freeze. A young boy, barely 14 years old, sits trembling on the golden throne of the greatest empire the world has ever known. But the crown on his head feels more like a death sentence than a symbol of power, because the man standing behind him, his own uncle, has plans that will transform this child from a king into a victim of one of history's most calculated acts of family betrayal. What you're about to hear isn't just another story of palace intrigue. It's the horrifying account of how a trusted family member can become the architect of unimaginable cruelty, how absolute power corrupts even the bonds of blood, and how a child's brief reign became a nightmare that would haunt the Persian Empire for generations. The name Bardia might not ring a bell, but his story will stay with you long after you finish watching. Let's begin with the empire that would become the stage for this tragedy. The Persian Empire in 522 BC was the most powerful force on earth, stretching from the Mediterranean Sea to the borders of India. It was a realm of unimaginable wealth, where gold flowed like water and the treasures of conquered nations filled palace vaults. But with such vast power came equally vast dangers, especially for those born into the royal bloodline. The Achaemenid dynasty had built this empire through conquest and cunning, creating a system where the king was not just a ruler, but a living god whose word was absolute law. Yet this divine authority came with a terrible price: paranoia, isolation, and the constant threat of assassination from those closest to the throne. Bardia was born into this world of golden cages and deadly politics as the younger son of Cyrus the Great, the legendary founder of the Persian Empire. While his older brother Cambyses was groomed from birth to inherit the throne, Bardia lived in relative obscurity, receiving an education in warfare and administration, but never expecting to wear the crown himself. Ancient sources describe Bardia as an intelligent and compassionate young man, beloved by the common people for his gentle nature and genuine concern for their welfare. Unlike many royal children who grew up surrounded by luxury and corruption, Bardia maintained a sense of empathy that made him popular among both nobles and commoners. This popularity would later become both his greatest asset and his most dangerous liability. The boy's world changed forever when his father Cyrus died in battle in 530 BC, leaving the empire to his eldest son Cambyses. The new king was everything Bardia was not: ruthless, paranoid, and increasingly unstable, as the pressures of ruling such a vast domain began to consume his sanity. While Cambyses focused on expanding the empire through military campaigns, particularly his obsession with conquering Egypt, Bardia remained in Persia, slowly gaining experience in governance and winning the hearts of his subjects. But there was another figure lurking in the shadows of the Persian court, watching and calculating with the patience of a predator. Darius, a distant cousin and member of the royal guard, had ambitions that far exceeded his current station. He was intelligent, charismatic, and utterly ruthless, qualities that made him both an invaluable ally and a terrifying enemy. Darius had served faithfully under both Cyrus and Cambyses, earning their trust through his military prowess and administrative skills. But beneath his loyal exterior burned an ambition so fierce it would ultimately consume everything in its path, including the innocent boy who stood between him and ultimate power. The stage was set when Cambyses departed for his Egyptian campaign in 525 BC, leaving the empire under a regency council that included both Bardia and Darius. For the first time in his life, the young prince found himself wielding real authority, making decisions that affected millions of lives across the known world. Ancient records suggest he handled these responsibilities with wisdom beyond his years, implementing policies that reduced taxes and improved conditions for common citizens. This period of relative peace and prosperity would prove to be the calm before an unimaginable storm. While Bardia focused on governing with compassion and justice, Darius was weaving a web of conspiracy that would soon trap the young king in a nightmare from which there would be no escape. The first hint of the coming catastrophe arrived with disturbing news from Egypt. Cambyses, already mentally unstable, had begun exhibiting increasingly erratic behavior during his campaign. Reports filtered back to Persia describing bizarre acts of cruelty, religious sacrilege, and paranoid purges of his own officers. The king was clearly losing his grip on reality, leaving the empire vulnerable to the ambitions of those willing to exploit the chaos. It was during this period of uncertainty that Darius made his move, setting in motion a chain of events that would transform a beloved boy king into the victim of one of history's most calculated acts of family betrayal. The conspiracy that Darius orchestrated was a masterpiece of deception that would make even the most cunning modern politicians envious. He began by spreading whispers throughout the palace, subtle suggestions that Bardia was growing too popular, too independent, too dangerous to the stability of the empire. These weren't random rumors, but carefully crafted psychological warfare designed to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of key court officials. Darius understood something that Bardia, in his youthful innocence, could never comprehend. In the world of absolute power, popularity with the people can be more threatening than any army. A ruler loved by his subjects becomes harder to control, harder to manipulate, and ultimately harder to remove when ambition demands it. The trap began to close when messengers arrived with devastating news from Egypt. Cambyses was dead, killed in what appeared to be an accident during his retreat from the failed campaign. But accidents in royal families are rarely what they seem, and whispers immediately began circulating about the true cause of the king's demise. Some claimed it was divine punishment for his sacrilegious acts in Egypt. Others suggested poison administered by his own officers who could no longer tolerate his madness. With Cambyses dead, Bardia suddenly found himself thrust into a position he had never sought and was unprepared to handle, sole ruler of the greatest empire on earth. At barely 14 years old, he now commanded the loyalty of millions of subjects, controlled treasuries that could fund armies for decades, and held the power of life and death over every person from the Mediterranean to the Indus River. But Darius had been preparing for this moment. As soon as news of Cambyses' death reached Persia, he moved with the swift precision of a predator who had been stalking his prey for years. He approached the young king with tears in his eyes and words of comfort on his lips, positioning himself as the grieving boy's most trusted advisor and protector. Ancient historians describe the next few months as a period of intense manipulation, where Darius systematically isolated Bardia from anyone who might offer genuine counsel or protection. Under the guise of helping the overwhelmed young ruler, he began making subtle suggestions about court appointments, military deployments, and administrative changes that would serve his ultimate purpose. The psychological torture began gradually, so subtly that Bardia probably didn't recognize what was happening until it was far too late. Darius would present the boy king with impossible decisions, then criticize whatever choice he made. He would arrange for disturbing reports to reach Bardia's ears, stories of rebellions that didn't exist, threats from enemies who posed no real danger, conspiracies among courtiers who remained loyal. Each fabricated crisis was designed to make the young ruler more dependent on his uncle's guidance, more willing to accept increasingly harsh measures in the name of protecting the empire. Bardia, desperate to prove himself worthy of his father's legacy, found himself authorizing actions that went against every instinct of his compassionate nature. The physical abuse began as what Darius called training exercises, designed to toughen the young king for the harsh realities of leadership. These sessions took place in private chambers, away from the eyes of court officials who might question such methods. What started as demanding physical conditioning gradually escalated into systematic brutality, disguised as preparation for the challenges of rulership. Darius convinced Bardia that a true Persian king must be able to endure any pain, withstand any hardship, overcome any weakness. The boy, desperate to honor his father's memory and prove himself worthy of the crown, submitted to increasingly savage treatment that left him physically broken and psychologically shattered. The final phase of Darius's plan required eliminating any witnesses to his crimes and positioning himself as the rightful heir to the throne. He began spreading rumors that the real Bardia had died, claiming that an impostor had taken his place. A lie so audacious that it could only succeed in a world where few people had actually seen the reclusive young king. When Bardia finally realized the true scope of his uncle's betrayal, when he understood that the man he had trusted with his life was systematically destroying everything he held dear, it was already too late. Weakened by months of abuse, isolated from any allies, and facing accusations of being an impostor in his own palace, the boy king had no options left. The end came swiftly and brutally. In 522 BC, barely 7 months after ascending to the throne, Bardia was murdered by the very man who had sworn to protect him. Darius claimed he had killed an impostor who had usurped the throne, presenting himself as the heroic savior of the Persian Empire. But the truth was far more horrifying. A trusted family member had systematically tortured and ultimately murdered an innocent child for the sake of political ambition. The boy who had dreamed of ruling with compassion and justice died alone, betrayed by the person he had trusted most in the world. Darius would go on to become one of the greatest rulers in Persian history, expanding the empire to its largest extent and implementing administrative reforms that lasted for centuries. But his rise to power was built on the broken body and shattered spirit of a 14-year-old boy whose only crime was being born into the wrong family at the wrong time. Bardia's story serves as a chilling reminder that behind every great empire, every magnificent palace, every golden throne, there are often hidden tragedies of innocent lives destroyed by the ruthless pursuit of power. His brief reign and horrific death remind us that the most dangerous enemies often come from within our own families, wearing masks of love and protection while harboring hearts filled with ambition and cruelty.